Welcome to the EmpowHERment Show, a podcast designed to empower women like you to take control of your lives, make informed decisions, and redefine success on your own terms, beyond the noise of influencer culture.
Hey, everybody. It is Sam here with the EmpowHERment Show, my lovely co-hosts, Adama and Maddie. And today we are joined by Dr. Aishatu Yusuf from Impact Justice. Aishatu is the VP of Innovation Programs at Impact Justice, which is a national nonprofit and innovation hub dedicated to advancing safety, justice, and opportunity through boundary-breaking work that honors and empowers people. Aishatu has led efforts to launch and sustain a portfolio of transformational projects there that work to reform and transform social systems. And during that, I have had the opportunity to work with her and represent her over the last couple of years in doing that awesome work. And we are very happy to have you here today. Hi, Aishatu.
Hi, same.
Awesome. Well, one of the things that we want to talk about today was in particular why it's so important to center women's experiences when we're talking about criminal justice systems and transformation, what gets lost when their voices are sidelined, and what are some of the unique issues that they experience, particularly when they come into contact with the justice system, and how those align with or compare or contrast with issues that women may have, particularly marginalized women who may not be in the justice system. So wanted to start off kind of by talking about your professional journey. I know you have done a lot of work over the years, just in terms of working with these communities and on what are really some groundbreaking and innovative projects for which even the state here in California has partnered with Impact Justice to invest in. And so just kind of wanted to hear from you a little bit about your kind of professional and personal path into getting into this work.
Yeah, so y'all want to get all of my business, I see. Okay, we can do that.
Always. I always want to get all of your business, girl.
So excited to be here. Thank you all for inviting me to be here. I'll also say this is the first time in like a public forum someone's called me Dr. Yusuf. So I was like, who is that? I don't even know who she is. But so it was like a moment that I was like, oh, I had to hear that. It was like
that is a crime. If I had a PhD, I don't know if it was in, girl, you couldn't call me for the doctor from the grocery store, nothing.
You know what? And
yes. You're like, hello.
Well, and Aishatu, the good doctor, has been working on all of these programs for years with us. And she was not in Sacramento one day. We were working on making sure they were able to access funding. And I'm like, where's Aishatu? And our colleague just sort of casually goes, oh, she's doing some things for her PhD today. And I'm like, she's doing a what? She's where? For a who? Like, she didn't even mention she was getting it. She was just like, I have another call. I have a thing. Just give them my ED. No big deal.
Casually.
First of all, mostly because it was trauma. Let me be clear about that. Like, you know, first of all, let me be clear. I suggest people get their EDD. You should do it, but maybe you don't work full time at a job like mine while you do that. Oh, yeah. And, you know, Sam knows me well. So Sam knows like this. My job is not for the faint of heart. So it is not, you know, I think we should do it, work part-time if you can.
Girl. I mean, work part-time if you can anyway.
Volunteer if you can.
Let's be real.
But if anyone has any tips for that on the next empowerment conversation, let me know how you do that.
It's a work less and make more. Thank you.
But I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me today. You know, it's really interesting. I think when you're younger and people are asking you, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's such like a random question to ask people, because the truth is that the trajectory of your life and your career is very often not linear. And it's very often a mix of both your preparation, your choices, the choices you don't make, the people you meet. And so it's always this interesting thing when I think about like what my path has been. Like, I didn't design this. I didn't design anything. I'm an Aries. I don't design anything. I just go with life. I'm really clear about that. I was raised in a Black family. So I did all the prep work to when I had the opportunity faced in front of me, I could step into it, as scared as I was. But the conversation of what my path was, unfortunately, I didn't design it this way. I had clearly goals that I wanted to do, and I knew success was one of them. What that looked like was up in the air, as it should be. I think you should give yourself time and space to be the person you can be. So, when I really thought about what I wanted to do and how I got to this space, I always knew that I wanted to work in a field in which I was providing space, opportunity, and voice to marginalized communities. When I was in undergrad, I did my senior thesis on the crack cocaine laws of disproportionately affecting Black communities that were happening under President Clinton. I thought I was going to be an attorney. When I went to grad school, I actually kind of shifted and wanted to do a lot of work on education policy work, which I actually did a lot of that. But never necessarily see myself as working squarely in the justice space on behalf of issues that are impacting people, impacting the justice system. That came to be by a variety of series of pieces when I was doing my education policy work, what I was noticing was that the young people that were in schools, particularly Black young people in schools, whether they were 1 mile away, 3 blocks away, or 10 miles away, they're often going to schools that didn't look as nice as schools that white kids are going to. I was living in DC right before I went to grad school, and one of the things that I was noticing was that when I was doing work inside some of the DC schools, like some of those schools had bars on them. There were people that were unhoused on the stairs, and the schools in DC, if you've been to DC, you can go 2 blocks and be in a completely different demographic that is, populated by millionaires and policymakers. And so when I went to school, I wanted to understand what is happening in Black communities that we could be so in such close proximity to wealth and access to education, economic mobility, but yet are not provided the access to it. So I wanted to do a lot of work around that, and that led me a lot into working and looking in the justice space from a different perspective. So I'll say that piece, and then I'll put a pin in that. The other side of this is, I come from my father's an immigrant to the United States. My mother's a Black American in the U.S. So I had an upbringing, which I understood kind of both sides of this world as both a child of a Muslim immigrant and a child of a Black American, which is both an experience in which you learn a lot about marginalization, but you also learn a lot about difference, right? The way in which the country engages with immigrants, particularly African immigrants, is very different than the way the country engages with Black Americans. And it's really important that we understand those distinctions, that they are different in many ways. But what I say that to say is I grew up in a small community. I'm from Utah. Yes, there are Black people. There's 1%. People always after they say, the thing is, your listeners are going to be like, oh my God, there's Black people in Utah. I'm going to fix it for you guys. Yes, there's Black people in Utah. There's 1% Black. When my sister and my mom and I left, that reduced, but there are still a lot of people there. People say, was it doing amazing things in a really tight community.
How did you end up in Utah?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't really I ended up in Utah, right? It's how my parents ended up in Utah. So my dad's an immigrant from Nigeria, just like all good Nigerians. He was going to school to get his second PhD because that's what they do.
That's what you do when you're Nigerian. That's right.
When I finished my schoolwork, when I sent the email out to my friends, I was like, turns out I'm more Nigerian than I actually anticipated. Here's another degree to add to my name. And a Black woman, Black women and Nigerians, we just add the degrees. So I was like, let me be stereotypical. I'll do it.
I'm pretty sure that Black women, Nigerians especially, are the most highly educated demographic.
Yes.
If there's anything that can be overachieved.
If there's anything that can be overachieved, just add in a Black woman to do it. We got you.
For sure. And especially a Nigerian woman. Nijo.
Okay, so I just, became really stereotypical with all of this. So my dad was an immigrant and he was going to school in Utah. My mother's from New York City, and she, was a woman that grew up in New York City in Harlem in, the 60s and 70s. And Harlem in the 60s and 70s is not what Harlem is today, particularly for Black women, for women generally speaking. And so when my mother's had an opportunity to go to college in her late 20s, a friend of hers connected her to a university in Utah, to Weber State University, and got her full scholarship. So she was like, I'm out. So she randomly moved to Utah. My grandmother, who I never knew, had passed when my mother was a teenager. So my mother's the only child, so she didn't have any more family. She had tons of friends, but not a lot of family left in Utah. And so when her friend was like, here's an opportunity to go to school, she had promised her mother that she would go to college. And she was like, say less, and moved to Utah. So my mother was in Utah going to school, and that's where she met my dad. And then my sister and I showed up some years later. And my mother...
So how did your dad wind up there, though?
How did what?
Your dad.
Because he was going to school. So, and he's going to school. He was going to school at Utah State. When you're an immigrant, it's expensive to be an immigrant to come into. People often have to understand this. If you are an immigrant coming to university schools, in state schools, particularly in the United States, it is very expensive to do so. So you kind of go where the dollars allow you to go. So that's why I often talk about, like, all immigration is not the same into the United States. And we have to think about that in a really broad way. So so my dad went to school. My mother was there also for school, and they met each other and had some kids. And then my mother, again, because, the New York she grew up in was not the New York she wanted her daughters to grow up in, because it's not the New York that, some of it that you see today. And so she stayed in Utah because she had a different understanding of what physical safety was and where she wanted her children to grow up, particularly be physically safe. My mother ultimately ended up being a single parent. And so I have two sisters. So ultimately we were in Utah because she felt like I was a physically safe space for us to be. I don't think that the terminology and the conversation really changed around what mental safety and psychological safety was really until later on, 80s, 90s, 2000s, maybe actually like 2000s. So as you can imagine, Utah's an all-white space. Not all white, predominantly white space. And so a different conversation that my mother didn't have with herself and wouldn't have made sense is, like, how do you raise Black children in a space that is dominated by one religion and one race, which is a different conversation. So I say often, I grew up in a physically safe place. Like, I didn't have to fear someone breaking into my house or anything like that. But I had a different experience around what it means to be Black in a very white, mono-religious space. So anyway, back to your question you were asking me. So my trajectory around getting into this work was because I was thinking, I was curious about why schools that young people are going to, Black young people are going to, are so different than the schools that some of the more moneyed white populations are going to. And so that they made me dig really deep into that work. And what started to come out of that really early on was because, was some of the early conversations on school to prison pipeline work, and those conversations. And so I started to do a lot of that. So when I got out of grad school, that was my entry point into looking at the justice space, is because I wanted to understand the school to prison pipeline work, which I don't use the term. I'm using that term here because I think it's more widely understood. But I worked really a lot with Dr. Monique Morris, and we did a lot of work. And the term we typically tend to use is school-to-confinement pathways around that work. School-to-confinement pathways. And the reason that what the nuance there is particularly we doing work on women and girls, which we'll get to in a big way, is that when schools do not serve the needs of students, Black girls particularly, often happens, it's not just that they have a faster trajectory to the justice system, but confinement can be many things for women particularly, whether that is abuse, whether that is actual confinement, whether that is, supervision, well, there can be a lot of things. And so confinement pathways allows for a bigger opening of what can happen when schools do not serve the needs of Black students particularly. And so that's really how I got into the justice space. And I was an evaluator for a long time. And so the justice space really allowed me to understand so many nuances of where we need to dig deeper, where we need to understand more, where so much harm is being done, where people were doing great work. And that led me to kind of this big opening of thinking about how we change the justice system. How do we think about transformation and reform, both inside the system and without, and from without, in a really big way. And my work at Impact Justice really allows me to do that. As Sam said, I with a lot of amazing people run the innovations team. And what that means, I play whiplash a lot. I'm going from talking about food to talking about housing to talking about mental health to talking about youth to adults to lifers to, jail on any given day. And so much of that is because all these different populations have a similarity of involving with the justice system, but a lot of differences of how they got there and what they need to stay out of there. So it's been, one of the joys I have in a really hard space to think innovatively about how we move the conversation around the justice space and the folks that need both the space to amplify their own voice, but also for the folks that are policymakers and decision makers to hear those voices, but also think about how they can change policy and practice to serve the population. That was a really long answer for you.
No, that's super helpful. I've never heard that phrasing before, school to confinement, and thinking about it from that lens, actually, because our audience is primarily women.
I also want to note, because I know our guy is actually, I misspoke, Dr. Monique Koofson. She changed her name a couple of years ago, so I want to make sure that I say her actual name, Dr. Monique Koofson. So, Kayla.
We got it. Well, I think,
But yeah, no,
it's an interesting lens that I had never thought about in the context of you just hear school to prison.
Yeah.
And apologies, my cat is making a cameo right now. Let's
your cat keeps popping up, and for some reason, like I keep registering it as if my cat's behind me. So I keep wanting to be like, how did he get up there?
Here.
Yeah. Anyway, carry on. Well, you mentioned, kind of that realization in DC of seeing how certain populations of students were versus others, right? And those inequities. Once you kind of got more into the space, and started working with justice involved populations more and more, were there any other kind of like defining moments where you went like, aha, this is actually my career path now? Like I'm doing this.
I do wish there were like light bulb moments like that. I really do. But I think what more so happened was, I think that, and I hope everyone has an opportunity to have this experience, which is I can make real change here. Like I can engage with people that can move the needle to create different outcomes for this population. I think that's what really kept me in this space, is that I had the privilege of working with really awesome people, you don't plan it this way, but I've had some really great mentors in my life that I've met through work, that have allowed me to both understand myself more deeply, but also to understand the work more deeply. And so I think that it was less about an aha moment, this is my career path, and more about I have an opportunity to do some really great work and meaningful work here with people who are smarter than me, people who have more access to me, people who want to bring me along to get that access, people who want to teach me through that, people who believe in my ability to elevate both what I have and others into a space that can make real change. And so, when you think about the justice space, it is a tough space to be in. That is a truthful statement. But when you really think about like the trajectory of what's happened, there are many people in this work that have been doing it a lot longer than me, but I have seen so much change that has happened in the last, despite who the president has been. Clearly that has created hurdles and stumbling blocks. Yes. But despite who the president has been over the last 40 years, there's been so much change in the justice space around how we talk about people impacted by the justice system, how we talk about what they need, how we talk about how they got there, how we think holistically about the truth about the justice space actually just being the end. And what really happened was disenfranchisement from school to workforce development, all these things. Like we weren't talking about that as broadly 30, 40 years ago. And so in some ways it was, but I kept seeing the movement and the change in a really tough space. And I wanted to be a part of that change. I wanted to be a part of the people who were moving that. I wanted to listen to the impacted folks that were involved in that and elevate those stories and elevate their experiences. And that's what kept me there, is really the fact that I've seen really big and small change, and that I've experienced that along with the people most impacted, and policymakers at the same time. I think the world of policy and practice has changed as well, and the words that we use. And so what kept me there, what keeps me here, is the fact that I know we can make a difference, and we have made a difference, and meet that in a space like this.
I think, you bring up conversations and discussions. And one of the things when we were prepping for this call, we talked about was how conversations on the sort of CJ environment and reform tend to default to men and men's experiences and the system. And, sort of just wanted to hear from you, why is that? And how does that differ from what the unique barriers that women who are, impacted by the system in one way or another are facing that may not get as much conversation?
Yeah. But girl, the why is that? That's the conversation of the century, of a lifetime. Yeah. I mean, it's really simple, right? The easy answer is patriarchy, right? The easy answer is that, right? But the truth is that the justice system and what's happening broadly in our world and in the United States, they coincide, right? Where the money goes is where the money goes. So when we're talking about issues of any marginalized community, the dominant group of that will be the ones that have the most power and influence, right? Mm-hmm. And so that in the world, actually, but definitely the United States, that has historically been men. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is a data conversation. There are more men incarcerated than there are women. Like that is also a data statement around who is in there and how they find services for them. So what's also happened is because there are more men by numbers that are incarcerated, that also means programming and policies and all those things do not consider the needs of women because one, our society doesn't consider the needs of women and girls, and especially women and girls of color, right? So that's one piece. And then second, because there's less of them, their needs don't elevate as high. Their voice isn't as loud. So the same thing that happens in our broader society also happens in the microcosm of the justice system. So the why is because there is the people that are controlling policy and practice and money and medicine and all of these things. They do not honor the voices and experiences of women.
What are some of the biggest needs of women who are in the criminal justice system that you think we have totally failed to address?
I mean, I can talk about that now, and that's going to lead us to the bigger conversation about my work. So I'll give it to you this way, which is, I think that in a society, when we think about the needs of human beings that are marginalized, right, we're often thinking about how do they get access to healthcare, how do they get access to economic mobility, how do they get access to mental health support services. I think everybody needs those, particularly marginalized communities. What we fail to think about the fact is that when women who have been historically marginalized and silenced need those things, they need it at a higher rate, at a different rate, and differently. And specifically, right? What often happens is they'll be like, here, mental health services for everyone. Everyone gets it, right? But the needs of men and the needs of women are different. How they experience the world is different. Their life experience is different. And so one of the things that we often forget is that people have specificities that they need. And if we do not get to those specificities, then they are not served. And so in the carceral space, when you're thinking about it, the reasons that women are often incarcerated differ oftentimes from men. The needs of them when they're inside, mental health support. Oftentimes women that are incarcerated have experienced intimate partner violence, years of trauma, years of abuse, substance use, but substance use that has the catalyst is often different than it is for men. Oftentimes data shows you that women are the keepers and the holders of family units. So when women are incarcerated, that family unit also often breaks down, but they still hold that need to come out and to serve their families. So when they come out of incarceration, they're plopped back into the need of their families without the jobs, the services to do that, without the opportunity to have jobs that are high paying, without services that help them get their kids back, without services that help them create different healthy relationships. When we're thinking about women that are aging in our system, there's no conversation around what it means to age, generally speaking, as a woman, what it means to age in a confined space, from menopause, from mental health, the experience of mental health. So all of these things show up in the space when women are incarcerated, yet there's policy. It's not even that policy and practice all support it. It's often not even mentioned. It is actually often not talked about. The food that women eat is different at different ages we talked about this earlier. As you age, your body changes, right? And the foods that you need, nutrition that you need changes. When you start to lose estrogen, there's a different conversation that needs to happen and how that impacts your mental health and your physical health. And for a carceral space, what that means in terms of being incarcerated and what that means upon your release. So we often fail to differentiate the needs of specific populations. And the populations that we're always going to fail to differentiate are those that have a smaller voice. And that's often going to be women in a society that honors and relies on the voice of men, particularly white men in spaces.
Is indicative then, in our everyday society, the systemic inequities that still exist, but magnified in the,
that's the same. So remember, in a carceral space, so you don't get choices. Right.
Yeah.
You think in a carceral space, whereas you and I'm not trying to speak for you, but I assume, given this outfit and cute little stuff, I'm making some assumptions about you, which is like, if you need something, you're going to tell somebody. You're going to say,
or I'm just going to get it for myself.
I'm going to go get it for myself. I know how to use the internet. I can do all of these things for myself. I have been privileged enough that I can advocate for myself. When you are in a carceral space, you cannot advocate for yourself in the same way, but particularly women, when there's a smaller population, right, and you are disenfranchised in a more robust way, it's even harder to advocate for yourself. You're also dealing with populations that come from marginalized communities. So they often don't even know the ways in which they can and should advocate for themselves. When you're thinking about changes in your body and your mental health, if you don't come from a community that honored your health and safety in a broad way, you don't even know sometimes where to begin the conversation besides something's not right. Right. So if you're in a space that doesn't have the services for you. You may not know the language to get the service. Then you just go in need, or it shows up in your behavior. And then it is inappropriately categorized as a negative behavior when really it's a medical issue.
And I think, sort of on our prep list for the pod, one of the questions is how do you, center women's voices to ensure that that system is transformed? And I reflect back on to one day you were in town at the Capitol with me, and I think I asked you, how do you come up with all these really innovative program ideas? I would have never thought to provide this, or I wouldn't have thought to prioritize this, or wow, where did that come from? And I used you to, or were you just sort of looking at me and being like, well, girl, we asked them, what is the big need?
It's really simple.
Yeah. Imagine that.
Well, what's funny is so many communities that don't have voices to access power don't get to just say out loud what they need. They have all these people in power making choices for them, right? And we know where that gets us. This is not related, but I was reading this article that was talking about, I live in the Bay Area. And so like every new, quarter, we have some like new cool innovation. Like there's new like driverless buses that can get you places or whatever. So one of the things that, I know it goes to drive, and so one of the things that I read this article that was talking about the fact that San Francisco solved for the wrong things. Tech is always solving for the wrong thing.
Girl, always.
And they are solving for the wrong thing.
Let's go 100% agree.
Yeah, they're solving for the wrong thing. And that is because it is privileged people making decisions about what privileged people need. And then someone might ask them what a marginalized person might need. They don't know the answer because they've never had that experience, right?
Right.
Whereas when you look in places like Nigeria or other countries that have large groups of marginalized people, they are using tech to solve for the right needs. They are solving for the needs of what people actually have. And that is because they literally are either one of that population, or they sat in the community with that population, or they asked that population, right? Like no one asked me whether I needed a driverless bus. Like no one asked me that question, which is fine. I'm not the governor. But if they would have asked somebody, what are the things that your community needs? I'm pretty sure nobody said driverless bus.
Yeah, pretty sure that doesn't come up.
Right. And so when you think about how you solve needs of people, you go and ask them. Like, and you accompany that question with what other really smart and brilliant researchers are doing in the field. Right. There's really nothing new under the sun. The truth is the conversations of the needs of women and their health is a conversation that's been happening for decades. Right. It's just that no one wanted to go and talk to them about what is that need, and then actually have the conversation with those who have money to say, do you want to help us solve that need? It's a very simple process. Talk to the folks in need, look at data. People have done both, do the research, fund the research, right? To accompany what that need is with the research so you know how to get there. And then you use both of those pieces to solve it. I know I'm making it super simple, but the truth is like it really is.
Well, it is simple, but do you think that part of the reason that people are solving for the wrong needs is because it's easier to put a Band-Aid on a problem or to solve like the easier issue than like the systemic problems? Or, I mean, is it just racism? Like what do you think like the root of this is?
Well, if you want to, this is a really big question that really gets to like capitalism. But to spare you that, to spare you that answer, I think the truth is that if you want to get to root causes, then you have to be honest about what caused that root issue. And the truth is that societies and cultures and policymakers do not want to sit in front of people's faces and say, our ancestors, our communities caused these issues, and it is our job to figure out the funding to figure out how to fix them. Because in order to move forward in a true fashion, right, you have to admit what happened. And that, to admit those things, is literally to rip a Band-Aid, not even a Band-Aid, like a full, like,
I was gonna say,
open a bleeding wound, sit with it. You got to
pour salt in it. Pour salt in it.
Rub around in it.
Cauterize it. Yeah.
Right? And then go across the street to the hospital and get a Band-Aid, which means you have to bring other people in to solve the problem. So the big answer to that is the reason we don't do root causes is because that completely destabilizes what America has decided is our foundation. Our foundation is not stable. Our foundation is disgusting. Our foundation is horrible. And for us,
our foundation is built on slavery, which is also what prison is built on, which is what our whole carceral system is built on. So it looks like that.
So it looks,
of course it looks like that.
It's not that Black communities were prone, right, for poverty. That's not how that works. It's not like, Black communities and Black. Exactly. It's not like Black women were more likely to suffer, right, particular diseases necessarily, right? It's that they grew up in communities that were disenfranchised, and that is the outcome. So anyway, that was a short response to the
I
question.
think it's and I think especially, again, as somebody who's like white privileged living in San Francisco, like this is something that's always been very frustrating to me about all the issues that we have in the city. Is it's like it feels like we just throw money at a problem, and all these investors or philanthropists come together and they're like, we're going to fix homelessness, we're going to fix drug addiction, we're going to fix racism, whatever the issue might be, and it's just like bull fucking shit. I'm sorry, excuse my French, but throwing $1 million as an issue to make yourself feel better does not solve for what you just described.
It doesn't solve for it. But you should do it.
I mean, right.
You should hand me the check so that we can think about how we solve those issues.
At the very least, if you aren't going to actually fix it, you should at least plug the holes.
You should at least
or give it to organizations like Impact Justice and like individuals like yourself who actually know what it takes to solve these issues. And I love, as a segue there, to hear more about like your work and like what your organization is focused on and what you do every day.
Yeah. I hope we wouldn't describe ourselves as like plugging holes. Although technically speaking, I think, unless someone wants to hand me the keys to the city, ultimately we're only doing so much, which again, if someone's listening, happy to take the keys to the city. I don't want to hold them and be in charge. I want to bring some other people in charge for that.
I mean, if this is how you announce you're running, we are thrilled to do that platform.
When I tell you it's a no for me, it's a no for me. Y'all don't want me there. Y'all don't want me there. Sam knows this. Like, I'm too flippant.
Love it.
It's a great segue. So Sam talked about impact justice a little bit earlier, but one of the pieces that really defines us as an organization is we are an innovation hub. So in an antiquated system like the justice system, as I mentioned earlier, there's been so much work that has been done that has gotten this entire country to a place that we have moved the needle on what criminal justice transformation and reform can and should be. We've gotten really far and yet so far to go. One of the things that shows up in the justice space, because it's such an antiquated system, because it is built on enslavement, is that we don't often think innovatively in that space, right? And part of that is because we're dealing with like scarcity and extreme needs, right? It's hard to think innovatively when we're trying to get people out of solitary confinement. It's hard to think innovatively when we're trying to give people proper food, right? So in some ways you understand how innovation was squashed in the justice space. But I think one of the things that we forget is that one of the ways in which we get to newness, one of the ways we get to a new place is by thinking differently about how to solve a problem. And so one of the amazing things that we do in Impact Justice, we get the privilege of doing that, is the foundation of how Impact Justice exists, which is how do we take a problem, many problems in the justice system, and how do we think about bringing in likely and unlikely partners to solve that problem? And how do we actually think about some of the things that that people aren't talking about? While the conversation should and has often, as an example, centered on solitary confinement, as it should 100%, we didn't actually talk about food, right? Because we were putting so much voice and resource to this other thing, we didn't mention these, that we weren't talking about healthcare in prisons, right? And, in the last 20 years, a lot of conversations have happened on reproductive rights for women and for women generally, but particularly incarceration. But that is a more of a recent conversation in the breadth of what justice reform has been, because while we were solving for how do we give people services, we weren't thinking about the fact that, like, how do we have a conversation on reproductive rights in here? So much of what Impact Justice gets to do is think innovatively and differently about how we solve criminal justice issues and problems with likely partners, unlikely partners, and most importantly, the impacted community and their families. And so that allows us, the thing that, we'll often say is, if it's being done or talked about, like, how do we support that organization that is doing that? How do we put fire under there? How do we throw resources at it or have our voice at that? But that is not a project Impact Justice is going to engage in. Impact Justice likes to engage in projects and conversations and narratives that are different. They're either different than the norm, bring in different partners, or allow us to think more broadly about how to solve the issue. And that kind of conversation is what led us to a lot of the work that we do on behalf of women in the justice space. people often ask, like, how did you come up with your menopause project? Or how did you come up with your food project? Like, how did you come up with, or the homecoming project? How did you come up with that? And sometimes we wish it was like this really big, elaborate conversation that like floors you. But the truth is actually very, very simple. When the Menopause Project as a really good example, we were in a conversation with a funder actually, and they were talking about a new innovation that they were investing in, in this organization that was thinking about how to get menopause care to women, particularly in rural communities. As I said, women are often disinvested, and just generally speaking in our country. So this health organization was saying we're trying to get telehealth for women that are in rural communities that don't have access to standardized healthcare, and that we can do it through using telehealth because they don't always have access to going to hospitals and things. And so we were like, great, have you? And they said, because, those are extremely marginalized places. So we were like, well, the ultimate marginalized place that exists happens to be a prison and a jail. Have you thought about what that would be inside of a prison or a jail or a carceral space? The answer is what we knew it was, which was like, not at all. And so before we think about any project that we do some research. Like, if someone else is doing it, like, how do we say, like, hey, keep it going? We have some ideas for you. Turns out there was no one that was really talking about it in a broad way. There are programs and organizations that were talking about menopause for women of color, thinking about, the Halle Berrys and the Oprahs and other smaller organizations that have been talking about menopause, I think, in a more loud, robust way, which I love. But we couldn't find a lot of organizations that were talking about menopause healthcare inside of prisons. So we did our due diligence around it. And ultimately, we landed on, if no one's talking about this in a really broad, robust way, how do we do that? And that's how we landed on that project. Our food project was really similar. When we were in a conversation, actually our president, Alex Uzansky, was in a conversation, and somebody said, how do we don't want kids to eat food as if they were in prison. And so our president said to this person, well, have you ever had food in prison? And they said, well, no, never. And they said, well, do you think that people in prison deserve food that's bad? And it made them stop and think. And so that took us like, well, who is working on this issue in food? Turned out we couldn't really find anybody. And so that led us to that conversation, what led us to a broader conversation around thinking about health and food and nutrition side of food. How does that differ for women? How do we think about bringing healthy food in? But what does that differ? And what are the needs of women in prison for healthy food? So many of our projects come from conversations. When we were talking, I was in a women's facility talking about some of our food work and asked them, like, if you had the opportunity to grow food in containerized farms in this prison, would you do that? They jumped on their feet and they're like, well, actually, one woman, an incarcerated woman, said, could there be endive?
Girl, yeah.
And I love the moment because one, it was like, I don't know. We're just asking you if this is a thing that you would be interested in. That led us to our growing justice work that we built containerized farms inside of prisons, and there in women's prisons particularly.
That's amazing.
So much of it comes from conversations, from data, from just kind of being alive in the world and listening. And it allows us to say, all of our projects, there's not funders that say like, yeah, I want to fund your menopause work. Like funders, there's not like an avenue of funding for these things. It becomes this area in which we really devise narrative around it and just start talking to people who should care about this. From our perspective, there's more individuals and healthcare professionals and healthcare funders that are interested in women's issues. And so what we get to do is come to them and say, you want to talk about women's issues. What about the women you don't see every day that are behind bars? Would you be interested in putting your dollars for women's healthcare to this population of people? And that's how we move some of these conversations and these narratives and these projects in a way that we ask people that care about the work generally to think about another population that is purposely out of sight and out of mind.
So who are you working with when you're having these conversations? Are these private funders? Is this government funding? And then how are the conversations with policymakers and like whatever the California, I forget, I can't even remember the acronym for the California Correctional.
CDCR, California Department of
CDCR,
California Department of
Corrections and Recovery.
Rehabilitation.
I was like, there's an R here.
It's supposed to be rehabilitation.
Yes, that's the one. My mom was a probation officer. She would be so upset that I couldn't even come up with that. But yeah.
I should be upset because it's actually my job. It's like actually my job to know this. But you get caught in acronyms all day that you're like, what is this?
Yeah.
So all of it. So, some of the work we do, all of our work happens in partnership. We do not pretend to be the all-knowing organization. We only achieve our work through partnership. But that is both funding partners, but also programmatic partners. There are people that are doing amazing work that can contribute and add to the work that we're doing that can elevate the entire conversation. So all of our work is in partnership, and we see our funders as partners in this work, and we bring them in as partners and collaborators in this work in that way. So when we're thinking about some of our work, oftentimes, so we work with governments, private dollars, individual donors, kind of a gamut. And the reason of that is because all that money kind of operates a little differently in a nonprofit space. But oftentimes, private philanthropy or individual donors, their dollars, they'll allow a little bit more risk, right? Because so much of the work that we're doing, right, there hasn't been a menopause project inside of a prison. There hasn't been a project that you use containerized farms to grow food inside of prison. Like, these things don't exist in a robust way. And so usually what we need are dollars that are flexible and willing to take risk. At Impact Justice, what we often talk about is the idea of risk and imagination. And we have to be able to use risk and imagination in thinking about how to reform and transform the justice system. Those terms are scary because we're dealing with people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And a mishap.
Right.
And a mishap.
On every side.
On
right?
every side. We're dealing
on every side. Because we still have to live with like the Willie Horton, that story in California. Like, that is like the boogeyman whenever people want to talk about funding for any kind of program like this. That's what we have to hear about, right?
Yeah, which is a data conversation. Like, I think it's important to know is that crime happens. We live in a society of human beings. People have freedom of choice. So that's one piece. Often the other piece is that we have created communities of desperation. We have created, and I say we, I'm taking myself out of that because I wasn't in charge of this community. I'm gonna take y'all out of that too. But communities have been created that reduce the choices that people have to survive. And so when we think about people's crimes that they commit, oftentimes they are outcomes of trauma, they're outcomes of disenfranchisement, they're outcomes of years and years worth of being beat upon, like both physically and from a society. And so oftentimes crimes that are committed because we have decades and years of disenfranchisement. And so it's not that people like wake up one morning and they're like, oh, I'm going to go like do a crime. It's
rob a bank.
Right. It's not usually how that happens. Do some people do that? Absolutely. I don't know them, but they have. I'm sure that happens. I don't know, like, sure. But that's typically not the people that are committing crimes. It is often coming from a place of desperation, often coming from a place of severe and consistent disenfranchisement that has led communities to this. We often call them survival crimes. We often call them things of that nature. And so I say that oftentimes, and people like to throw out to us like, well, this terrible crime that was committed. We have to get to say, like, that's not most crimes. Like, most crimes are not that. Most crimes are not that. Most crimes are committed, one, in insular communities. The truth is that most crimes are committed in small communities with people that they actually know. And so we're able to provide investment and education and economic mobility and money and food and care and love in those communities. Those things are less likely to happen.
I mean, I feel like that's like the Baltimore example, right? Like, they've been able to significantly reduce crime, and it is because, frankly, I think they have a mayor who understands it. They have a mayor who is of the community and understands what some of the levers are that can be pulled to actually reduce some of these outcomes that we're talking about.
You've seen it in Richmond. You've seen it in Los Angeles. You've seen it in Oakland, California. Like, you see a lot of places where you put investment, then things change. When you clean up streets, like the broken windows theory, when you clean up streets, it reduces crime. Like, all of these things exist, and people, and I think, are short-sighted and don't like to think about these things as holistic issues. They like to pin down on this one individual, this one crime, and yet don't think about all the things that led to that moment that exist in that way. So to answer your question, though, around like who we speak to around these things is all of that. So we usually start with philanthropic dollars or private dollars, and usually small dollars that help us craft an idea and put it into paper. Then we get to think about how do we do a small pilot to see, I'm an evaluator, so we think about doing pilots to understand how do we do a pilot, and then think about how do we make it better? Are we actually doing what we said we're going to do? Are we impacting the community we want to impact? Do we have the right people involved in that conversation? And that allows us to make a pilot into a program. And then usually when it gets to a program side is usually when public dollars come in. Samantha could talk a little bit more about this in that way, but public dollars are y'all money. That's my money, right? So oftentimes governments are less willing to take risks, which I think is terrible, right? Like, I think that we should take risks with dollars, calculated risks all the time. I think it's a terrible way to be. But typically how it happens is that public dollars are less likely to take risks because it is public money and they have to account for it in different ways. So typically we've got in a private funder or a philanthropic investment that allowed us to pilot a program, do some research around it, do a little evaluation. Then we get to take that over to a public entity, a state, a county, a district, and say, look what we've done in this small scale. This is how this could be bigger with your investment. The other piece too is, without getting into a conversation on private dollars, because I could talk about that all day and get into this capitalism conversation all day long. But the other piece too, these are government jobs. Like, this is the government's job to fix the ills in which the government allowed to be created, right? When we're thinking about providing healthcare for women in prisons, like, it is the government's job to ensure everybody has access to healthcare that can serve their needs. All right. So when we are able to pilot up, I don't know if they remember that all the time, but it's my job and others' job to continue to tell them that thing. And so I think once we're able to pilot a project or create a narrative around a project or collect enough data to demonstrate this is an issue, then we can go to the public and go to legislators and policymakers and say, this is your job to fix this hole that has been created based upon years and decades of policy. How are you going to invest in that way? And that's how a lot of our programs grow over time. But I do a lot of fundraising and all transparency, and a big piece of that fundraising allows all of our team members to think about how we would get money to invest in new ideas. How do we grow ideas that work? And then how do we get public dollars to support the growth of those ideas?
Yeah. And I think, Aisha, too, when it comes to the sort of public dollars, particularly when it comes to legislators, right? They get hyper-focused on what's in the press or what's before them or what's the biggest polling issue. And I remember when we were looking to fund and expand on the Homecoming Project, there was initially some pushback. Like, look, we're looking at homelessness right now, and why do we want to spend our time and energy on these people who, did something bad and were in jail? Well, look at the data. 70% of people who are unhoused in California are formerly incarcerated. So these are those people. These are the same people.
You're going to service them one way or another.
Would you like to do it acceptably or,
Yeah, well, the truth is, to add to that, is 98% of people that are incarcerated get out. So they all need somewhere to go.
Wow.
So most people that are incarcerated...
I'm sorry, that's a hell of a stat.
They come out, right? They come out.
Yeah, you're right.
They come out, guys.
Most crimes are not murder, and most sentences are not life. You're right.
You will get out. Right. And so if you're not thinking about the services you provide to them when they go in, then you are not doing your due diligence about the citizenry of your communities. And what often happens is they're coming from oftentimes disenfranchised communities. They're going into a prison or a jail when we're not receiving their services. And then we ask the question on the back end, well, why did you go back into that crime? Or why did you die of a heart attack? Like, we're asking these questions that it's pretty linear. If we went back to that moment they're incarcerated, what were you providing them that they can make different choices when they come out? What were you providing them so they could get a job? What were you providing them so they can get a house? Are you providing them so they can be healthy? If the answer to that is nothing, then I don't know what the expectation was on the back end.
I mean, every conversation should start with that stat, because I grew up with a mother who's a probation officer, and that stat literally blows open new pathways in my mind. Because of course all of these people are going to come out. Of course.
They're your neighbor. They're at the grocery store with you. They're everywhere around you. Right. And if we're not thinking about how we serve them and provide them resources, then we're not doing right by our communities, period, because it impacts all of us.
All of us.
Right? When you think about houselessness, Homecoming is a great example. So the Homecoming Project is a project in which we take just regular community host homes. Let's say, Maddie, if you had a home in San Francisco that you had an extra bedroom in that you aren't using anymore, I would come to you and I would say, hey, can I use that bedroom to house somebody leaving prison? Yeah, first you're going to say, in your head, you'll be like, oh, heck nah. That's what you're going to say first. And that is okay with me, because what I'm going to say to you after that is we particularly house folks that have been in prison for a long time, because their recidivist rates are lower, but also they're the ones that are less likely to find permanent and stable housing because they've been out of the community for so long. We go through an entire vetting process for you. We don't know who you are, Maddie. Like, I'm going to vet you. I'm going to vet the person leaving prison. There's no assumption that either of these individuals can live together. So we vet you, we vet the person leaving prison, we make a match. If turns out Maddie's a neat freak and the person leaving prison is not the person for you, I'll say, Samantha, you're less of a neat freak. You can deal with their room being a little messy. Okay, so maybe that's a better fit. For clarity, people leaving prison are typically not neat freaks. I want to be clear about that. They are absolutely neat freaks. If you've ever been to a carceral facility, order is the way. So this is a very
like the military. Yeah.
It's an original statement. But we match the people leaving prison with host homes. And we've done this in Alameda County, Contra Costa County, and Los Angeles. And we have conversations all the time that people want a project this. When we really talk about it, people are like, I'm not going to let a person leaving prison into your house. And we literally laugh at that because we're like, you get into airplanes, cars, buses, walk around the grocery store, who you date, all these things, and you don't know people's background. It's the minute I say to somebody, oh, they were incarcerated, that the stereotype goes up. Instead of saying, can I get to know that? Can I know who that person is? Right? Craigslist, all of these things, written.com. We do all of these things without full knowledge. And so when we get to say you then have the access to actually open up your home with full knowledge to help support somebody, then how do you do that? We also know that data shows us that when someone leaving prison is in communication or in partnership with someone that's different than them, and that person's in relationship with them, it changes the lives for both of those humans. In our homecoming project, we have a 0% recidivism rate. We've been doing this project for 4 years. We've not had a single person while in our program go back to prison. And that is because we're changing the way that we engage. We've also not had those people be on the streets, right? Because they have a home. When you have somewhere to lay your head at night, you are more likely to get a job. You have the access to get a job. You have a good night's sleep to get a job. You can begin to worry about your mental health, your physical health. And when we think so, like a project like this, when we go to legislators and they say, we're dealing with homelessness right now, we're like, we're dealing with the student population. We're just trying to prevent them to getting to the streets or providing them a house before that actually happens. And when we think about women, this becomes also a different conversation. The needs of women going into folks' homes are a little bit different. Thinking about women,
I was going to ask you, do you have you had more success placing women coming out of prison into homes? Because I can see there being a connotation or perception with like men coming out of prison, people feeling less safe than women.
Yeah, no, that's the answer is no. It's about equal. And part of that is because we do a lot of vetting with conversations to match people. One, there's also less women that leave prison. Like, again, we deal with folks that have been in prison for a long time. There's a smaller population of women that have been in for a long time. But even when we get them out, and our hosts, we absolutely operate the opportunity to host the sex and gender that makes sense for you in your home is your discretion. Right? If you say, I don't want a man in here, we're not going to put that.
This is really a fascinating conversation. That I don't know why I have never heard that stat or really thought about that before. That legitimately blows my fucking mind.
But after you hear it, it's duh. Like after you hear it, you're like, oh, but right.
Oh, of course. Of course, these motherfuckers coming home. Of course.
Your comment about Craigslist set me. I'm like, that is even more sketchy than letting somebody from prison come into your home.
But they do it all the time. Airbnb. Right. You don't know who the hell anybody else is, but people do it all the time.
Totally. Yeah, and we actually, my family has some property in San Diego, and we work with a veterans program, a homeless veterans program, and I'm guessing it's probably very similar because they'll pay a double deposit, and they'll pay half of their rent, and they do a lot of matching, and the program works really well. I mean, it does. It works really well, and we've got 2 houses that have nothing but veterans in them, and they are veterans who are homeless. They were not, like fresh from Iraq or anything. These are people who have been in long-term homelessness, long-term drugs, and all kinds of other situations, and they are trying to figure out how to reintegrate. So I'm guessing that it probably works really well.
Well, Aisha, too, can you speak back to also to just money going back in communities? Because I know one thing that legislators actually really started to get excited about here was communities that were really targets for gentrification and people being able to reinvest in their community because they were participating.
Yeah, Homecoming is truly an amazing program in which when it was created, we were like, we're creating a housing project, but we really created was like this kids community project that allows different people to engage together to actually do a lot of community uplift in a lot of ways. And so the way Homecoming works is we anyone who has, in the communities in which we work in, anyone who has an empty room inside their house and they have to go through a HUD inspection, we don't let folks into unsafe homes, and have the availability to be there, then we can place a person leaving prison into that home. As you can imagine, when we first say this to people, a lot of people are very apprehensive about the project itself because they're thinking about the societal stereotype of what it means for someone to leave a prison. And so a lot of what we do in all of our programs, but Homecoming is around narrative shift and narrative change to bring a project like this work. But one of the things that we also think about is a lot of the folks that were first to open up their homes were folks that were tied to religious communities that believe in second and third chances, folks that they themselves were incarcerated or they have loved ones that were incarcerated, and are oftentimes also communities that were Black and Brown, because in our society that disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities through incarceration, they're more likely to have someone that they love that has been incarcerated. And so what often happened is our homeowners weren't like rich homeowners on the hill. They were regular people that had homes in communities, and we got to give money back. And oftentimes in communities that are being gentrified. And so we put money back at the community. I think at this moment, we put over $700,000 back into communities, particularly communities that are Black and Brown in California, that they now can do things that change their home, right? We've had folks that have fixed their roofs, that have fixed like things that were breaking in their home that they couldn't afford to do, and that they were able to fix up their home. You know, we give them a stipend to be able to go paint the room, fix the door, do what you need to do. So we're doing community uplift, putting money back in the pockets of oftentimes Black and Brown families and communities while also housing people. And our hosts often become our people that, they need the money, right? We're paying 6 months of someone's rent, so they need the money, which is a great side hustle to have at it. That's lovely. There are people who don't need the money, but want to do a community good. And they don't know how to do that more than just give to a charity. They want to do a community good. There's a variety of folks in that way. So it's really a program which we're providing housing for folks while putting money back into the community, particularly Black and Brown homes. And one of the things that's been really amazing about this project is that we've created such really beautiful experiences with the folks. We have communities, we have folks that have taken in someone leaving prison that they now take them on vacation long after they left their home. They are auntie and uncle to their kids, that they were sometimes that host home is the place where that person leaving prison saw their kids for the first time or their grandkids for the first time in their backyard. So there's all these beautiful experiences and stories of people when you just let community work, when you let people give to each other. And for women in this community, so we actually have we have women that are host homes. So like push back a little bit on this conversation of like what safety is, right? We have women that are host homes and have hosted women and men. We also have women who only host them. Like we have a variety of it, but we also have people that come in and say, I'm going to try. Oftentimes when we get it, I'll do it one time only. And maybe now I'm at like 7 times.
This is how we got into the veterans program. Literally, my mom was like, we'll do it for 1 bedroom. And now we're
like, wait. Yeah. And the requirements we have is we actually have the requirement that we don't allow just you to buy a home and have all the bedrooms full of formerly incarcerated people. We actually have to have the homeowner there, because part of what we're doing is not trying to create transitional care in the traditional way that the state does it. We're trying to build community so they can engage with the person that
I love that
in that way. And for women in our project, what we've noticed is, one, we give stipends to them as well. We give every participant stipends every month to help provide their basic needs as they're looking for jobs and getting other needs. We notice that women clearly have higher needs. They have dollar needs. They need tampons. They need other care that is very specific for women. They're also typically statistically the ones that are trying to get their kids back. So we give so we're giving money to women. So we're giving money to everyone. We're thinking about how do we give more money to women because they need it for different needs, different services. Everyone doesn't need estrogen patches, right? Everyone doesn't need the things that women particularly have. So that was the other piece. Also around mental health services that we're providing. We're also thinking about what the women need. Everyone could typically use some mental health services that are leaving prison, but it's very different the needs of women that they have. So we're like, how do we find providers that typically work with women that are coming out of incarceration? So in all of our programs, we're thinking about how do we provide to the general population that we serve, and then how do we make sure we meet the needs of a marginalized population like women and women of color, particularly in those projects.
I love this. We're having all these conversations as we're having the pod, and some of them are incredibly like kind of downers, right? Because we've been talking a lot about budgets and this administration and what that looks like for women, for people of color, for children, for marginalized populations in general. But we had a very good friend on the other week. His name's Trey Borden, and we were asking him about systems and processes and like, how do we rebuild? And his response reminded me of this whole conversation, because his whole thing was, I don't know. I'm not worried about like the systems as they are. He was like, I'm an artist. I think about what is possible, what's next, what's new. And I'm not worried about rebuilding that. I'm thinking about how do we make something even better? And that sounds like a lot like how you guys are approaching this. And it's just incredibly refreshing to hear that and to know that there are people who are doing that work, who are talking to the people who are actually affected, surfacing their challenges, creating programs to address them and fix it. So honestly, Dr. Yusuf, thank you for your work and for coming on today and just talking about this, because I think it's good to have these conversations be uplifting, right? It's good to have these conversations not just end as, yeah, the whole system sucks, we're just doing our best. No, you guys are thinking creatively. I love it. And just thank you.
Yeah, no, we often say that we work in possibility, right? So that's typically how I think about the work, because I work in the place of possibility, right? We already know that it can be bad. We see that every day, that it can be bad. So we have to work in a place of innovation and imagination and possibility. What is possible? And I think, do we work in a place that is thinking about what is next and what is possible? Absolutely. I also work with the folks that are part of the system, right? Because the truth is in order for me to create possibility, I have to work in tandem with the folks that are currently in a system. I have to work with the prison. I have to work with the jail. I have to work with people that are there, because that's where the people that I care about are. And that's where the people that I care about are experiencing that. I care about folks that are in prison or experience incarceration. So I got to go to where they are, which means I have to develop relationships with folks that are in charge there. It doesn't mean I have to agree with them, right? But it doesn't mean I have to fight them at every corner. It means if I have a need, I want to talk about menopause care inside of a prison. That means I have to talk to the prison, right? And so I get to take, you are providing healthcare in the prison, and especially in California, they've done a lot of work around providing healthcare for people inside of prisons. Like they've done a lot of reforms through our legislature, through the governor in California regarding healthcare. So what I get to come to and do and say is, that's great. I'm so happy you're doing that. There's another population of people that you are not thinking about, that this issue is disproportionately affecting them. Women are experiencing menopause in our prisons because they are aging in prisons. How are we going to have a conversation with you to think about the aging population of people in prison? When they come to me, which they did, and said, no, it's not really an issue here. We're not seeing that. We get to go back and say, can you tell me the ages and statistics of the people that are in prison? Like, I'm a data person. I'm a data. So I'm going to just show right? And then I get to engage in conversation. It doesn't help for me to go in and yell at them and tell them like it doesn't help. Sometimes I have to yell, but rarely to them, right? They're in charge. I'm not in charge of the prison. I'm not in charge of the jail. And so it behooves me to work in partnership with them to get to meet the need that I have, which is to serve the people in prison. It's the same thing when working with the state, when I'm working with legislators and policymakers, right? I think oftentimes there's this conversation about policymakers, just trying to get reelected and all those things. And whatever that's true or not, have at it. I don't actually care that much. What I care about is how I get that policymaker to see the needs of the population I care about and see themselves as a part of that solution. So when I go to talk to policymakers on the Hill that probably, they're majority men, right? When I sit in front of their face and I get to say, so menopause, right? It's a conversation that I get to bring them in, because oftentimes there is a cis woman that they love. There's a cis woman that they care about. There's a cis woman that birthed them that they may know. And so you get to bring them into the conversation and say, if you care about healthcare for women, this is another thing that you have to care about. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes that conversation leads to them asking more information. And what we get back, and one of the best things I love is I get notes like, I went and talked to my mom. I went and talked to my wife. I went and talked to my sister. And I had never thought about asking them this. And I learned this thing about my partner, about my mom, about this thing. And then it opens up a whole new conversation. That exact thing has happened with legislators and with the legislators in California. They have come back to us and said, I actually went and mentioned this to my wife and it blew her mind. Right. And so I think it opens up pathways of conversation as well to allow even people that are policymakers to think more expansively about what they can do. And part of that, you know, is I am a woman. I am a Black woman. I get to say this in front of their face and bring them to that. My you know, the president and founder of Impact Justice is a white man, and he gets to stand alongside me and say that exact same thing. You need to care about menopause, about healthcare for women in prison who are predominantly Black and brown, right? So when me and my wholeness gets to say that, and him and his wholeness gets to say that, it allows people to experience like, okay, who am I? What do I say that? Where do I care? How do I care? And how do I make a difference? And I think so many conversations get so icky for people because they can't see themselves in it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Whereas I think that some of the issues that we're never going to see our full selves in every conversation. I am never going to be Samantha. So I don't know the things that Samantha's experienced, but if Samantha comes to me and says, these are the things that I'm experiencing because of who I am, then it allows me to say, right, okay, and how do I help support those needs of those folks? And I think that is what's happened on the Hill for us. That's what's happened with our funders. That's what's happened with some of our population. Some of our population are like, ooh, now I should care about that thing. And so I think it allows us to help everyone see the world as possible.
I love it. Well, it's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for all the work you do. And thank you also for coming on the pod. Do you want to talk about empowerment moment?
Oh yeah, what did I send you guys? Yeah. I have to remember like what I sent you guys.
Well, and also is there any message you want to give to our followers if they are interested in impact justice, if they'd like to contribute or just be interested, or if they're interested in the homecoming program?
Yeah, I love some good messaging. You know, I think here's what I would say. I say this to everyone is I work at Impact Justice. I believe in impact justice. I have amazing colleagues that I think do amazing work. I work in partnership with other organizations that I also believe do amazing work. But my real ask for people is to do something. Whether that is the conversation on women inside of cross facilities, whether that's thinking about girls that are disproportionately impacted, whether that's thinking about food, my ask for people is to do something. Now, if that something happens to be in relationship to some of the amazing projects that we do, that's awesome. If your listeners are really into food and they can think about how we think about food in prisons and carceral spaces, please contact us. If you're thinking about how programs can better serve women in carceral spaces, please contact us. If menopause is your thing, hit me up. I'm your girl. If you're thinking about how we think about housing for people leaving prison, hit me up. I'm your girl. But my ask for people is to do something and to work with organizations and people that are doing work that's going to change the lives of marginalized communities wherever you are and whatever that might be.
I love that. I mean, that dovetails really well with what we always say, like, find your thing. You do not have to boil the ocean. You do not have to be at every march. You do not have to be at every boycott, protest, whatever, but find your thing, get engaged, educate yourself, and stay on these people's motherfucking necks about it, period.
I stay on neck, as you can
that's our whole deal.
She does. We do. We'll see you up here soon. Aisha too.
Can't wait.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been another fabulous conversation. Thank you, Dr. Yusuf, Sam, Maddie. Till next time. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, listeners.